Okay, I think we're about ready to get started. So I want to start today with a little bit of a class discussion, kind of mapping some ideas onto the board here. We've been talking so far about natural selection, how natural selection drives adaptation of species to their environment. Now what I want to do is talk a little bit about a field we call island biogeography, and then we'll link those back together in our Galapagos case study next week. So, what do you guys think? Just from what we talked about last time, what kinds of things, sorry, you good? Yeah. What kinds of things might affect the number of species on an island? Yeah, sorry, if you're with my map.
So one thing I talked about was dispersal ability, like can the species get to the island?
Food.
Food. Explain a little bit.
Like the number, like the amount of vegetation or something.
So, of course, this only applies to animal species, right? And many of these species might be plants, but similar, you might expand this into nutrition and think about soils here and then there. Yeah. Predators. Okay, good. So, of course, the predators have to already be there, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And back here?
Climate.
Climate. Okay, good. So let's do climate here. Why climate? Why might the climate affect the number of species on an island?
Oh, are you asking me?
Yeah.
Oh,
Just to expand it a little.
if they can't like adapt to that climate, then I would survive.
Okay, so that refers to not just the dispersability, but can you colonize successfully, right? So can you survive? Yeah. Anything else you want to add to climate before I go on? All right. Anybody who hasn't yet?
It might go with the resources and predators, but like competition between.
Okay, so we get predators as one kind of species interaction, and competition as another. Now, if you're on a very young island, and there aren't very many species there yet, how do you think competition might relate to the number of species on an island? Or how do you think competition might be different on a young island with few species?
Some species that is more fed could, kind of just take over and run out the other ones.
Well, then if there's few, then there wouldn't even be that many to run out, right?
Yeah.
So then you have all kinds of resources yourself. Good. Anything else anyone wants to add to this? Yeah.
The island area.
Yeah. The area of the island. And why might the area of the island affect the number of species that can survive? It's geography. What kinds of factors? Pass it behind you?
It's geography.
And so, what might you expect the relationship between the area of an island and its geography to be? Yeah.
So let's say it's a really big island and it's elevated. It may have different weathers, and it may have a lot of animals that can survive in one weather and fewer that can survive in the other.
Yeah.
And that may make a lack of resources.
In different regions. Yeah. Okay. So this island area, which I think is where you were going as well, excellent, is area of the island predicts to some extent the variation, how many different climates are there along the island, the leeward versus the windward side, the high elevation versus the low elevation, those kinds of things. Might also affect what kinds of, if you're an animal, what kinds of food resources are available, because plants reflect very closely the climate of wherever they're growing. Of course, the area is also going to affect the number of other species there, but that's what we're trying to estimate in the first place. So predators and potential competitors are part of the total number of species. Let me give you a term here. Number of species is species richness. So we're going to start out with our little model that we're going to do in the slide there, thinking about just number of species. We're not going to worry too much about exactly who those species are and what their roles are. We're just going to be counting species. Could be all plants, could be all lizards, could be all lizards and plants and birds and whatever. Just how many are there? So we've got, anything else you guys want to add to this? There's another one that makes a big difference. Yeah.
Maybe if it's an invasive species, it's able to compete and it's more able to reproduce because it like drives out all the other species.
So I would link that right in very closely with, actually, invasive species are kind of interesting because they tend to be things that have high dispersability. They tend to be things that survive once they get somewhere. And they tend to be things that have high rates of reproduction despite the presence of potential competitors. So that actually links each of these together. But it still has to do with the identity of the species. So competitive ability / invasiveness has to do still with which species are arriving. But I want to know what might influence the total number of species that an island could support. Does anyone remember how far the Galapagos are from South America? I gave it to you in metric last time, so you might not remember.
Like 600.
Yeah, a little over 600 miles. Yeah, about 1,000 kilometers, a little over 600 miles. That's kind of a long way, right? And we were talking about imagining shedding animals and plants in the Pacific Ocean, most of them just dying because they land in the ocean. How do you think the number of species on the island might be different if the islands were a bit closer? Yeah.
Some animals would be able to swim there and it wouldn't be as hard to colonize it.
Yeah, and the converse is true if it's further away, right? The odds of your ability to get there as a species is going to be influenced by the distance. And I said from South America as opposed to, say, Asia, something like that, or even North America, because in this particular case, the main source of currents that are sort of surface currents in the ocean are coming from the coast of South America, right? The Peru current, or used to be called the Humboldt current. So you have to identify some kind of a source pool. And yeah, you could imagine that the source pool might be the entire world, and then which species make it on the island. But in this case, you can think of it, for the purposes of our model and our activities in class, that the source pool in this case will be basically South America, because that was going to be bringing things up there in the parts. So, the area of the island is a pretty good predictor of the variation in the kinds of habitats, and therefore the kinds of food resources, the kinds of environmental conditions, and so forth, that might be on an island. But these other things, like presence of predators, competitors, the competitive ability of those organisms, how dispersible these organisms are, and how likely they are to survive once they get there, these are all attributes of species. And what I want to show you is a simple model from MacArthur and Wilson. So I think I showed you guys this already, where we know that there is a positive relationship between island area and number of species. In this case, this is a graph from 1958. Yeah, it's right here, Darlington, 1958. Just looking at reptiles and amphibians on islands in the Caribbean. This is not all of the islands in the Caribbean, but it shows you this general positive relationship. And we talked about being careful about looking at these axes and noticing that they're logarithmically scaled here. So this was part of the evidence supporting the contention, or the assertion, that the area of the island might be a good predictor of the number of species on an island. So let's think for a moment about the conceptual framework that MacArthur and Wilson proposed for predicting the number of species on an island, and then we'll go from there. We talked about how far the islands are, how isolated they are from the mainland. how would you predict an island that's more versus less isolated to, which one would you expect to have more species than the other? Yeah, less isolated probably have more. In terms of habitat diversity, which we've talked about, which one would you expect to have more species?
More greater.
Yeah, greater. And we'd probably find that. We might find that habitat diversity on which kind of island? Yeah, one that has a higher elevation gradient, or more difference in elevation. And these things might be related, although not always, but often related to which kind of island would you expect to find more species? Yeah. So this is Robert MacArthur, and this is E.O. Wilson. E.O. Wilson's still around. Robert MacArthur passed away, unfortunately, pretty early, not long after this was published in 1967. I forget how long after, but I think it was
1974.
It was going to say in the 70s.
43 years old.
He passed away early. So, and Wilson continued to produce, and MacArthur likely would have as well. Nonetheless, together, they made a big impact on the field of biogeography and of ecology in developing this model. A simple model for predicting species diversity. I might change this. Initially, the very first version of this that we're going to look at is actually a neutral model. And what I mean by neutral is that the identity of the species on the island, this imaginary island we're going to model, doesn't matter. All that matters is that the species are different and we can count them up. So here's our Galapagos Islands. We've got big ones and little ones, and they're more or less distance from each other, and of course they're all about the same, about 1,000 kilometers from the mainland South America. But let's think about their model. And let's start by thinking about the axes. So ignore my red dot for a second. What are the axes on this, this little plot I've made here? What are the x and y axes? Yeah, number of species and some rate. This is species per unit time. In this case, we're going to start with an immigration rate. And we go from 0 species on an island to P, some large value that represents the total number of species on the pool. So this could be all the species in Peru and Ecuador and Colombia as our source pool. Or it could be all the species in South America. You can kind of tailor this number conceptually to whatever the source pool might be for your particular island that you're trying to model. So then the actual number of islands on the number of species on the island is going to fall somewhere in between no species and all of the species on the source pool. When there are very few species on an island, and you start getting propagules, or individuals dispersing from the mainland, the rate at which you acquire new species is going to be really high, because most individuals that arrive are going to be species that aren't already on the island. As time goes on, the number of species on the island increases, and the rate at which you acquire new species with each new individual that arrives goes down. And you could imagine that if all of the species in the mainland were on the island, if you packed 2 of every one on the island, right, then any new individual would belong to a species that's already there. So that would mean the immigration rate is at 0. So that's just the relationship between the number of species on the island and the rate at which new individuals represent species that aren't already there. Now I'm going to label this axis slightly different. It's still a rate, it's still species per unit time, but now individuals that are on the island are going to die, and occasionally the last individual in a given species dies, and we call that extinction. In this case, it's local extinction. It's extinction on the island. Another word for that is extirpation. To totally extirpate something from an area is local extinction. But we use the term extinction nonetheless. And when there are no species on the island, there's no extinction. If you're one of these early species there, like you were talking about, or an invasive species that's early, that's there, what are the odds that you're going to go extinct? If you get to an island and there's all this vegetation and habitat there, and you're the first animal to arrive, what do you think the odds are you're going to go extinct? Pretty low, right? That's great. You come to a buffet and there's no line. if you imagine packing all the species of all of South America, 2 by 2, onto an island in the Galapagos, a lot of them aren't going to make it. There's just not enough resources for all these species, not enough habitat diversity for all these species in a given area. So we see an opposite relationship here. And the two lines cross. There's a point at which the rate of new species arriving with each individual dispersing, and the rate at which the next one that dies is the last of its species, balance each other out. So the point where these cross is our equilibrium, where the immigration rate and the extinction rate are equal to each other. Again, this doesn't say anything about which species they are, just that that is the number of species you predict on the island given this model, this simple model. Now, this is not what you'll see in your textbook. It's not on the slide that's coming right up. I've drawn these lines straight, super simple. There's no effect of different species. What we normally see is this kind of a figure, and this is what's in your textbook. If you have already read that section, or if you go back after class today and look at it, you'll see the lines are always drawn curved. That's because species do vary in their dispersal ability. So individuals that arrive early and often tend to be individuals that belong to species that have high dispersal ability. Think birds. Whereas individuals from species that have low dispersal ability, I don't know, maybe worms, right? They're going to have a very low, a very small portion of incoming individuals will belong to those species. Predatory mammals would be a good example. Often on islands we don't have very many predatory mammals, but they have lots of birds, and the birds become flightless because there's no mammals trying to eat them when they land, so you can get bigger and eat plenty of food and do quite well without having to worry about flying away from a predator. In any case, the nature of these curved lines is incorporating some variation in species attributes. So it's no longer a purely neutral model. The nature of your dispersal ability affects where you are on this, affects the curvature of this line. The variation in dispersal ability among all species affects the curvature of the line. So here's that figure that we often see. Notice, once again, it goes from 0 to P. There's some equilibrium, S. There's an extinction rate and an immigration rate. And if the species richness on the island is out here, then we expect over time the system to return to this equilibrium. Return to that equilibrium doesn't mean it's the same species, just the same number of species after some time goes by. And if there's some event that removes species from the island, we might expect that they will eventually return to that equilibrium. So that's the original version of the model of island biogeography from MacArthur and Wilson. Again, it's more or less neutral, and it also ignores one thing. So a couple things to think about here. The equilibrium is dynamic. What that means is that we're just, as I've said 3 times now, we're just worried about the number of species on the island, predicting the number or the species richness, not which species are there or how they relate to each other. It sort of simplifies variation among species and their interactions, which is useful because it gives you a simple model that can allow you to predict island biodiversity anywhere in the world. And then from there, if you see deviations from that, you've got an interesting biological project to understand the Galapagos, or understand Hawaii, or understand Madagascar, or something like that. So it gives us kind of a null expectation. And it also ignores something important we've already talked about with respect to turtles and snails. What else does it ignore? We talked about endemic species on islands. Yeah. Yeah. It also ignores the accumulation of new species descendant from colonists of the island. At least the original model did. So before I go on to give you a little thing to think about for the future, after the publication of the Theory of Island Biogeography, Simberloff joined Wilson's team, and he helped design an experiment where there are these mangrove islands off the coast of Florida, I believe it was, in the Gulf. And what they did is they covered all the islands in tarps, sort of sealed them off, and then fumigated them to kill all the insects on the islands. And then they watched the number of species on these islands, which vary in their size and their distance from other islands in the little cluster of mangrove islands, they watched that number of species increase over time after they removed the tarps and allowed the fog to dissipate. They were also able to compare the accumulation of species to their original diversity before they fogged them. So they went to these islands, they did a survey, who all's here, which species of ants, which species of beetles, and so forth, measured their species richness, and then compared the new species richness after 680 days with where they were before. The idea being, if these are equilibrium values, then we should expect the islands to return to something very close to that. And that's in fact what happened. There's a little bit of variation here, but it's not all that different. So this was an elegant test that you probably would have a hard time doing today. Probably a lot of paperwork to do something like that. Any questions about this experiment? The last slide on here, which might actually be in a different position in the slide that's on Moodle for you. I want you guys to read this. The island biogeography has continued to develop and has been a source of all kinds of investigations over the years since the 60s and 70s. And so we now do think about something like in situ speciation, the formation of new species on islands, and how that affects the number of species. In some places, well, anyway, I encourage you to take a moment and read this. It incorporates more than just that purely neutral model they introduced to you of my little cartoon, and it shows you kind of where the field has gone since the 70s.
It's, for me, this is the single paragraph in science that sums this up in the most concise and understandable paragraph ever written on this subject of island biogeography.
And you'll see some of the roots of it said in a single sentence, right? Island area sets the maximum richness, but you'll also see some of the stuff that we haven't talked about. And yeah, it does it we can put it on one slide and you can read it. Good. All right, so this, I think, is where I expected to be at the end of class last time. Any questions about island biogeography? We've talked a little bit about natural selection already. Where's my display here? Okay, gather windows. What happened to you? Oh. Am I back? No, I'm not back. Yeah, now we're talking. So we've talked about natural selection a little bit already, and now I want to give you guys some background on it, sort of a history of science that I think you might find interesting. So the theory of evolution by natural selection and the idea that those four premises, if they're met, you will get descent with modification and you will get adaptation as a consequence, a natural consequence, comes from, is generally attributed to two people. I mean, if you look it up online, people always say, oh, everyone forgets about Wallace. But I think in the last 10 years or so, as a biological community, we've done a really good job of remembering Wallace's contribution. So it's good to think about it as independently derived by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. They weren't strangers to each other, but they weren't exactly working closely together either. Let's start with Darwin a little bit. I'll show you a picture of young Darwin in a moment. Probably the most formative experience of his life, at least for us, our discussion of evolution by natural selection, is his voyage on the Beagle. So they left England to map the coast of South America, and he was fortunate to be the ship's naturalist. And he started developing a lot of ideas during that voyage, and continued developing them for years and years afterwards before finally publishing the book that we call On the Origin of Species much later. He took some things with him on the book. He got a new copy of the first volume of what was later to be published, a series of volumes of a geology textbook called The Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. He collected lots of fossils and preserved specimens of animals, and started writing about stuff. As soon as he got back, he continued for many years. This is Charles Darwin here, and I'll introduce you to Wallace partway through. I'll give you a little more background about Darwin. He was born in 1809 in England. His mother died when he was young. I think he was about 8 when his mother died. His father was a reasonably wealthy physician in the English countryside outside of London. And his father wanted him to go to medical school and be a physician as well. And so he was sent to start learning that at age 16, pretty young. I think normal for the time, but very quickly it was clear that he didn't like the sight of blood, he didn't want to be a physician, it just wasn't working for him. So he left medical school and began studying theology at Cambridge, at Christ College in Cambridge. And that's where he was able to make friends with some of the natural historians, people who went out and collected specimens. So one of his favorite classes was with a botanist. He went out collecting insects. He went on geology trips to Wales. And this is where he focused his energy and his attention. He passed his seminary and theology courses. He graduated, not particularly with honors or anything, but he was spending a lot of his time doing this natural history stuff that he really loved. In 1831, after he returned from a geology trip to Wales, he got a letter from his old botany professor inviting or suggesting that he join this voyage as the ship's naturalist of the Beagle to go map the coast of South America. And originally, his father wasn't very supportive, but his uncle, I believe, convinced his father to let him go, and so off he went as the ship's naturalist. He struggled on the boat. I don't think it took him a while to get his sea legs, but whenever he would get off the islands, or get off on an island to explore, he would take lots of notes, collect. He was all in on his job as the ship's natural historian, as the ship's naturalist. It was 5 years. They started off, they went around the southern coast of South America, and there were stops in Patagonia in the South Atlantic where he would collect fossils. They went around Tierra del Fuego in the southern tip and up to the Galapagos, where he started making observations about finches and mockingbirds, and collected specimens that maybe he didn't know exactly what to do with at the time, but they were the source of fruitful conversations with experts on various birds and insects and fossils when he got back to England. And that's part of what led him to compile all this evidence that led to the publication of his book On the Origin of Species. Famously, it was in 1838, while he was doing all these writings on barnacles and movements in plants and various other projects that were generally related to his ideas and questions about evolution, that he read, and he said sort of for fun, he read an essay by Thomas Malthus on population growth. Malthus was really concerned about all these poor people in England having lots of babies and starving. And there's some interesting kind of cultural conversations you can have about those ideas. But reading that essay is what gave Darwin this idea that if not all individuals in the population can survive and reproduce to their fullest potential, the ones that do are going to shape the next generation. And he writes that that was one of the moments that crystallized this idea of how natural selection might progress. But he still wasn't getting it all written down. In 1857, I think it was, 1850s, he was making a lot of progress on his book after having read Malthus in 1838. And then in 1858, he received a letter from this guy, who at the time was in Malaysia. And they had written and corresponded once or twice before then. They knew of each other. He was a big fan of Darwin's work and of his publication of The Voyage of the Beagle, this big adventure he went on. So let me tell you a little bit about this guy. He was 14 years younger than Darwin. His family wasn't as wealthy as Darwin. He was English, but he grew up in Wales, which incidentally isn't all that far from where Darwin went on his geology trip, right before he got the invitation to the Beagle. And he was reading all these books by people like Darwin and Alexander von Humboldt and others who were traveling the world as naturalists, collecting all these specimens, going on these incredible hikes, meeting the people of the world to help them with their collections. They didn't do this all by themselves. They always had local guides and helpers wherever they went that they depended on for their knowledge of how to get from point A to point B and what animals to collect and how to get them. And he had this idea, wouldn't that be great? I'd love to go do something like that. But he hadn't graduated from college like Darwin. He didn't have a mentor at a botany department like Darwin. But he did have a friend named Bates. And they decided together that, well, if they could scramble up enough money to get to South America, they could collect a bunch of stuff and become better scientists, become better naturalists, and also sell a bunch of extra to make the money necessary for the trip and pay back the loans they got and that sort of thing. So they decided of all the places to go to the Amazon rainforest, a place that Europeans hadn't explored very deeply. We'd mostly been along the coast. They went there together at first, and then they separated. They had a base camp in Belém, in, I think, Brazil, and they would go off on their own with help of native people who lived in Brazil at the time, and collect all kinds of animals. He was mostly interested in insects and birds. Bates was also interested in insects and became famous for other contributions. And about 5 years into that trip, after going out collecting and then eating and going out and collecting, he said, okay, I'm going to head back now and see what I can do with all the stuff I collected in England. And then the ship caught fire and everything sank to the bottom of the Atlantic. And he was on a rescue boat for several days, and then another boat coming back from Cuba happened to come by this wreckage and picked up the survivors of his boat. So he lost almost everything, but had just enough money to make it for a few years based on the specimens that he had shipped back earlier on other boats. So that was able to help pay off some of his loans, and he lived off the insurance of all the stuff he lost. And he was sort of bitter about the whole thing, but eventually decided, this is my dream, this is what I want to do. And so then he took another trip much later to Malaysia, to the Malay archipelago. And there, once again, he was collecting. He was living not too far from what's Singapore today. There was a guy by the name of Ali, named kind of after, Alfred Russel Wallace. He took that name as his Western name, who was a Malaysian who collected most of the birds that are attributed to Wallace now. So he got all these people, assistants, students, to help collect all these organisms and really build a name for himself as a naturalist while reading Darwin's work. And he decided, I've got this idea that finally came to him while he was laying in his bed, recovering from another bout of malaria. I think I know how this could work, how natural selection might work, those 4 premises. And so he wrote Darwin a letter saying, what do you think of this? I'm thinking this might be a good thing to contribute. I'd like your feedback. I've been working on this stuff for a long time. Darwin got the letter, went to his friend and said, this guy wrote my abstract. Like, his sentences are my chapter headings in my book I'm working on that I've been working away at for a while. Unfortunately, because of the communication distance, there was not as much communication as we might like today, but Darwin combined his stuff with Wallace's essay, which was a personal letter, on the advice of Charles Lyell, the geologist, the author of the book that Darwin took with him on the Beagle, and his friend Joseph Hooker. And Lyell and Hooker presented this paper sort of on behalf of both Darwin and Wallace. And this is their paper. On the tendency of species to form varieties, and on the perpetuation of varieties and species by means of natural selection. And it was presented in 1858 on behalf of Darwin and Wallace by Lyell and Hooker. And I just want to point out here, based on the title, we've been talking about natural selection as a means of modification of individual species, but you can combine that with mechanisms that isolate populations and allow them to adapt independently to different settings, and get to this idea of the formation of varieties and species. So, what's really in this? I mean, you can go and read it. It's available online. This might even have been a screenshot from the online PDF that you can get. And they said stuff that you guys already heard once. This is what they got from Malthus. They both read it. That more organisms are produced in a population every generation than can possibly survive. If you start out with some low population, as long as population growth is positive, you'll potentially, any organism has the potential to grow exponentially. But we're not a mile deep in elephants or mice or anything else. So there's something limiting. Not all of them are reaching their full reproductive potential. So the environment can impose some limitations on population size. And we'll talk about these kinds of population growth models very soon. They also show that phenotypic variation exists. Here's a histogram of students binned by height. So each line is people who are within about an inch height of each other. And you can see that they're tall and they're short. Right? There's all kinds of traits, phenotypic traits, that vary like this. They also said something that everyone kind of already knew at the time, was that variation is heritable. But how we thought about heritability wasn't at that time what it is today. At that time, there was this general sense that there's something funny about the model of, well, if you got two parents, the offspring is going to be some blend in the middle. But if you imagine two parents as like two different buckets of paint, if you blend them together, like a white and a black paint, you end up with gray. And then if you have next generation, two grays, you blend them, you get gray again. So that was kind of the conceptual model of blending. But also we kind of knew that wasn't always the case. And there are certain traits that just don't work that way. We're not all gray, we're not all the same after just a few generations. So what this shows is a more modern way of thinking about heritability that actually trace its roots back to farmers, people who were in animal husbandry. If you take some phenotype of interest for some organism, maybe it's a cow, like the amount of milk it produces or something like that, and you compare the phenotype of the mother to the phenotype of the offspring, you'll get some relationship. If there's low heritability, you should expect a cloud of points comparing mothers to offsprings. And if there's high heritability, then you have a really good, you have a better chance of predicting the offspring phenotype from the parent phenotype. So heritability is just the relationship between the parent phenotype and the offspring phenotype. When you have two parents, we often will take the average of the two parents and compare that to the value of the offspring. So that's heritability. You'll see it's often denoted with this term here, h squared. You're not squaring anything when you see this, it's just what we use to represent heritability. But you've seen this before as the slope of a line. How many of you are familiar with y equals mx plus b? Yeah. So this is a line and it has a slope, the m value. In this context, we represent that slope as heritability, or h squared. They also argued that phenotypic variation is heritable, and that these heritable traits generally have a genetic basis. Now, they didn't have the same understanding of genetics as we do today, but the idea here was that the variation is heritable, which you just saw. Some traits vary in the population, whereas others generally do not. So these are the kinds of traits that are more likely to respond to evolution by natural selection. The reason I put this up here is that when we think about heritability in this course, at least for the next few units, I want you guys to be thinking about phenotypic traits that vary within a population. If we think about traits that don't vary in a population, at least genetically, like the number of fingers on your hand, right? That's something you inherit from your parents, from your ancestors. We all have 5 fingers because we inherit that, but there's not that variation upon which natural selection can act. So I'll use inherited when I'm talking about traits that don't have that kind of variation that can respond to natural selection. Graphically, it would be hard to put h squared if every parent has 5 digits and every offspring has 5 digits. Where's the slope without line? It's just a point. All right. So phenotypic variation is heritable, as we were just saying. And here's a relationship in red of finches. Oh, sorry. Let me get rid of this so you can see the axis. No, come on. All right, this isn't going away, but this should say the mid-parent height, or sorry, mid-parent bill depth, mid-parent bill depth. So you take the average, not the average, you take the midpoint of the mother and the father of any given finch. So what's the midpoint of their beak bill depth? So this is a trait that varies. How thick is the beak in a finch? And so here's two parents, that's their mid-beak depth. And you can compare that to their offspring, which is on this axis. So each one of these points represents a comparison between the finch of its bill depth and the bill depth of its two parents in 1976 when these samples were taken. Did I see a question? What's the blue line about? How's the blue line different? Yeah, it's a different year. And what else is different?
With the bird's children, offspring.
Say it again?
It's with the bird's offspring.
Well, so each one of these points is the offspring from 1978 and its parents of that year. Right? What's different about the two lines, like mathematically? Yeah.
The offsprings have different depths of beaks when you look at the years. Like I can't read the year from that clear.
Oh yeah, sorry. 1978 is the blue, and the red is 1976.
So they're getting longer.
Yeah, there's a shift here, right? The y-intercept is higher. So there's been a change in the average value of beak size, but the heritability of the trait is the same. The slope is the same. This is the stuff that we're going to be exploring in the Hendry et al. Paper when we think about selection on beak size and shape. This is just one aspect of beak shape, the depth of the bill. And that, it turns out, affects the nature of food resources that you can utilize. So a deeper beak gives you that ability to break harder nuts, which tend to be, nuts and seeds, mostly seeds, tend to be harder when they're more desiccation tolerant. Those are the things that are going to make it in a dry year. Whereas in a wet year, you don't need to have a really strong, deep bill to access seeds that are pretty soft and aren't adapted to dry conditions. So we'll be looking at this heritability stuff, but what I want to return to as we think about natural selection is this idea of a selection service or an adaptive landscape. Now this is a metaphor that we'll explore a few times, but this surface that we talked about, right, where you're relating variation in phenotype to survival or some measure of fitness, gives you a surface where if you're up here on this end, your probability of survival is high, and if you're over here on this end of the phenotype, then your probability of survival is a bit lower. And this is a way you can think about natural selection, not just by memorizing those 4 steps, but by thinking about it as something you can graph and explore visually. So these are going to reach more of their reproductive potential, and these are not going to make it as much. Oh, right. So one thing I didn't get to that I wanted to make sure I got to at the end here is this idea of adaptive landscape and the nature of selection. So in this case, they demonstrated that selection was occurring, right? They demonstrated that the ones that have shorter horns relative to their head size are less likely to survive. They're more likely to be shrike-killed than the ones with longer horns. But what we didn't talk about is all the other things that might be affecting these lizards. So in the years since this paper was published, we don't go out to Texas and see lizards with horns this long with even higher survival, right? Because all you have to do is be about this big and you're good in terms of shrike predation. But also there might be other things that aren't good about having super long horns. So occasionally we see runaway examples where selection does take you to very extreme phenotypes. Think about antlers on moose or peacock feathers, right? Those are really extreme versions where having a bigger and bigger display means you're much more likely to get chosen as a mate, and you're much more likely to be represented in the next generation. But here, maybe there aren't benefits to having a super long horn. Nonetheless, we see that shrike predation is imposing selection in one direction, directional selection for longer horns. And of course, there might be other things that are also influencing this. Maybe horns can only get so big in the developmental process of being a lizard. But this is the shape that we tend to see when we talk about directional selection. And we'll talk about other kinds of selection with the finches on Monday. Any questions about this and connecting this back to Darwin and natural selection? I had good participation from a bunch of groups today. And I went a little bit quicker through the story of Darwin and Wallace than I anticipated. Paul, is there anything you'd like to add at this point? I know I'm the surprise question.
Darwin generally gets more credit for the idea because he had it first. So by 1844, he had written what he called an abstract. It was about 180 pages at the time, and he had actually shown that to Lyell and Hooker, and so they were aware of his thoughts along this line of thinking at the time. But Hooker in particular thought that he needed to develop his idea more thoroughly, and so he continued to work on it, and by about 1856, I guess, Hooker was finally convinced that it was an idea worth doing something with, and was actually encouraging him to publish it, but Darwin still wanted to do even more work on it so that he had this kind of ironclad case. And so finally by 1858, when Wallace comes out of the woodwork with his idea, Lyell and Hooker had already been encouraging Darwin to finish and publish. And so they were aware of his work, and as a result, his ideas were much more complete, and that's part of the reason that Darwin got more of the credit for many years.
It's also why he was able to publish his book the next year.
Yeah, because he had already been working on this thing. It was already quite long at the time. But I always try, and whenever I tell the story to students, their story has a lot of lessons for you. One of which is don't procrastinate. Like, get the thing finished, because in the case of Darwin, he almost got scooped as a result of not finishing something. Lessons that I take from Wallace's experiences. Wallace overcame all kinds of adversity, poor education, poor family, disease in South America, the shipwreck, but that dude just kept pushing on and on and on. And so, as a student, you're going to face adversity, but you're certainly not the first person to face adversity. I suspect Wallace has probably faced way more adversity than any of us will ever face. And the other thing is, don't assume that your prior experience determines your destiny. Whatever you came to college with in terms of your high school experience and things like that, you're turning a new page here. And Wallace didn't let his background impede him in any way.
In fact, he was able to take some of his background and use it to his advantage. Like, his first job after getting pulled out of school because they couldn't afford it was as a surveyor's apprentice. So he learned how to make maps.
Which is invaluable if you're exploring an area of the world that doesn't have any maps, for example. So, overcome adversity, and don't think that whatever you did in high school is a determinant of what you're going to do in college. And that works both ways. You may have been a stellar student in high school and you may struggle in college. You may have been a so-so student in high school and then you really thrive in college. So treat each day, each week in college as a new set of challenges to overcome, and you'll do fine. so there are a lot of other lessons that you can draw out of these two people's lives. But oh, and the last thing I would say is Darwin's family wanted him to go to medical school, wanted him to become a doctor, and Darwin basically said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's not for me. So another thing about college students is you may find yourself changing majors a couple of times, even over the course of your 4 years here. There's nothing wrong with that. The purpose of you being in college is to try and figure out what you're going to do with the rest of your life. And so be open to the idea that it may not be the thing that you think is going to be your future right now. And keep in mind that you may have to buck familial expectations in order to do the thing that will fulfill you on a daily basis. So find whatever it is that you're passionate about while you're here at Williamsville College, and then pursue that. My experience with students is that students who find something that they're really passionate about tend to do much better in that field than if they're in a field that they're not particularly passionate about. So Darwin was passionate about natural history, and that's what he went off and did, and we find ourselves talking about him in 2021.
Before I let you go, this pause moment gave me a chance to think, and there's one other thing I want to share with you all with respect to working on things, right? There tends to be a time for certain ideas. Science tends to focus on the things that it's recently learned how to observe and learned how to measure, or learned how to explore in the case of traveling abroad. And so it's somewhat to be expected that as Darwin gets closer to these ideas, that other people were too, in the case of Wallace. And there's a few, one example of ideas kind of becoming ready or ripe for discovery comes from his relationship with Charles Lyell that I left out. And I really like this story as a geologist. So Charles Lyell was not a biologist, he was a geologist. He was well-traveled throughout England and parts of Europe, or in most of Europe, for looking at different rock layers and thinking about how they're related to each other, and how the geography and geology of the world came to look the way it does. And at the time, nobody had a good idea of how old the Earth is.
Not true.
Well, there's lots of ideas.
Not true. There was a guy named Bishop who was a theologian who went through the Bible and counted up the generations of the Bible.
I have a point about this though. Lyell knew about this bishop who had gone through the Bible and had back calculated the age of the earth. But he also collated and collected stories about the age of the earth from a variety of cultures. He looked at the Hindu Vedas. He listened to the stories of the Chinese. And if you read it today, you can hear that it's an 1800s person recounting what he's heard and read about the Hindu Vedas. But there were all these ideas, some of which had come up with this idea that the earth was formed this long ago based on things we see around us and how old people are. The world seemed to be young. And so this bishop back calculated from the age of the Bible, or back calculated the age of the earth, estimating the generations that are accounted for in the Bible. From the Bible in Europe. People were thinking about these things in India, in Asia, in other parts of the world as well, and coming up with different stories. So there was this conflict that arose that Lyell tried to inform by thinking about the variation across the world, and saying that it's common for societies to have stories about great catastrophes remaking the world. And then Lyell was thinking that, well, actually I see these catastrophes like a volcano or a flood, and yeah, they're devastating to the people that live there, but they generally don't affect the whole planet. They affect local areas. Vesuvius would erupt in Italy, or a flood took over a great valley of China and led to a big story there, the origin of that landscape. And so he thought that maybe it's just as likely that people have a tendency to exaggerate these things and make them seem very significant for their culture and frame them as something that happened to the whole world. And that even we might be doing that in Europe. That might influence the way we think about and approach the question of earth sciences and the age of the earth. Whereas Lyell's point was that actually most of the things that happen to us, floods and volcanic eruptions and fires, are local and they're happening kind of constantly all the time. And if you give if you imagine a world that's old enough, those sorts of things gradually could give rise to the landscapes that we see today. Now, today we talk about catastrophism and Lyell's uniformitarianism in a little more sophisticated way. There, in fact, were major catastrophes that wiped out most of life on Earth. We call them mass extinction events. But this idea of uniformitarianism, of the present processes and the rules that control them, like floods and fires and volcanoes, operating over very, very long time periods, kind of gave Darwin something that he was missing when he was thinking about how could you get all these new species on Earth if the Earth's only 6,000 years old, as this bishop said. And so Lyell's model of Earth as being very old gave Darwin sort of another key to thinking about how you can get so many species. Time is the important thing.
Yeah, so Lyell gave Darwin a very old Earth to think about. And the other thing that kind of made these ideas come to the fore among Darwin and his contemporaries is, as you sent, the European navies out into the world to explore, what happened was they brought back all these animals. And so the universe of kind of what was possible to think about in terms of the diversity of plant and animal life in the world became harder and harder to explain over time. Once again, going back to the religious views of the time, people thought the Earth was much younger, much less biologically diverse, and there just comes a point where it's difficult to fathom Noah putting all of the species on the Earth on a boat and saving them all from a global catastrophic flood, because you go to South America and you start having naturalists shipping back specimens of all these millions and millions of species. It just begins to strain credibility. And so Dr. Judd is right. The time was kind of right with all of these things coming together at the same time. Darwin was not the only one thinking about this. He was just doing the best thinking, and Wallace also, the best thinking, the most kind of scientifically valid thinking at the time.
And especially synthetic thinking,
Yeah.
drawing from many fields. That was the key part of it.
So,
There are some really great stories about the bishop who back calculated. There's the, who was the one who estimated the age of the Earth based on how fast it would cool from a molten state?
I do not recall.
I forget the name, but there are many examples of people thinking about this, about how we could determine the age of the Earth. And the reason I said nobody knows is because it wasn't until the 20th century that we developed radiometric dating and we got a better sense. And that's why if you look it up on Google, you'll get 4.5 billion years old.
Yeah, I said, people knew,
For
because
sure.
had you asked people at the time, they would have said, 6,000 years.
Yeah.
Good, which we know is just not sufficient now.
That's all I have for you guys. Be prepared
One day.
to discuss the introductions and the Henry et al. Paper.
Draft of the introduction, 1 page, print a copy, bring it. You'll be working in groups on Monday to go through that.
Bring a printed copy.
Do you wanna kind of copy that?
Sure, yeah, that's great.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if I have
Yeah, nothing special. When we make an assignment,
Okay, so there's a paper on here, and it's in the folder for Monday. And it's a paper by Henry et al. It's called something about finches. I forget the title. I always refer to it as the authors. Henry was the first author of the paper. And then he's got a bunch of colleagues. That's what it calls about. And it should be in that folder for September. What's it? Yeah. And all you have to look at the whole paper, but focus on writing a summary of just the introduction section. And it should be about a page. And if you need help doing that, go.
Yeah.
Have you emailed
me and not Britt?